how far ahead you buy your ticket depends on how much you pay. So in the morning, if I'm thinking I'm going to make a trip, you know, I'm thinking, should I take the car, take the train? I'm not thinking, should I take the car, train, or plane? So our trains are pricing as if they're competing against airlines, where actually at the moment we want them to compete against cars so we can make this spontaneous decision. So there's lots of complications. The big issue, we privatized, we didn't have government investment. The subtle issues is about the pricing strategies as well, I think. And, you know, how the pricing makes it impossible to make an affordable train trip if you decide 2 days ahead of time. So there's a million reasons. I've just given two, but it's subtle and complicated and obvious at the same time for someone who lives there and wants to take the train.
Oh, okay, so thanks very much. So I'll just move on to ask Paul if you could share your views on the same question. So is it dangerous to talk about low-hanging fruit? And if not, do you have any that you would point out in terms of climate policy? And where are we going to face the biggest hurdles?
Okay, so let me first of all say I absolutely agree with everything Elizabeth said. Carbon taxes are important, they are part of the solution, but they're not going to achieve that much because the amount of, you know, the amount we would have to charge for a proper carbon tax is just too high. The problem we have with transport is at the moment we do not tax aviation fuel. And so we are essentially subsidizing air travel relative to other forms of travel. We're not going to sort of, that isn't a proper carbon tax being neutral across the economy. We're actually distorting the economy because we're imposing carbon taxes on some and not on other parts. But let me move on to what I think we really need here. It is system solutions. What we need is, first of all, we need to recognize there's a problem that's urgent. I think we've got that, at least in most of the world. We need to set targets for where we need to be, and we're sort of getting to there in terms of net zero by 2050. Then what we need to do is map out a strategy which is going to get us from where we are now to there. And that's where what we're missing. Well, at the moment, what we have is a long list of initiatives, but we haven't worked out how those initiatives are actually going to deliver our targets. And I think what we're actually going to need in the end is a strategy for probably every industrial sector and every large firm to say, how are we going to make that industry and that firm consistent with a transition to net zero? At least in a broad brush scenario, and get industry to own that and deliver it. Otherwise, we're never going to get there. In terms of the targets, I agree there's not any low-hanging fruit. The immediate targets are several. In Europe, we often talk about improving energy efficiency of buildings as being an obvious target. You could save a lot of energy just by making homes and offices more energy efficient. And similarly, by decarbonising personal transport, if we could move away from fossil fuel cars, you would achieve quite a lot. The problem with those things is they require millions of individuals and firms to make decisions to go along with that. And that's difficult. It's difficult to legislate for, it's difficult to nudge, but it is what we should be trying to do. If you look at things which are probably easier to control from a central perspective, getting rid of coal has to be pretty near top of the list. The UK has largely done that, not completely. Our fossil fuel for the national grid is largely gas, and we need to do more to reduce our gas usage. But we need to look actually then globally at getting rid of coal. And the thing about climate change is we're not going to achieve success just by looking at the UK or Europe, because we could get down to net zero in the whole of Europe and still find carbon emissions going up the rest of the world to fill the gap. We've got to help the rest of the world get its carbon emissions down, particularly on coal, and particularly in places like India. And we have to commit to helping the world solve its problems and get to net zero, not just focus on a parochial policy set. So that will be my sort of starting point for answering the questions. But we do need to think about system solutions rather than relying on individuals or people to make the roads. For example, having individuals flying, doing carbon offsets may be all well and good, but it's not going to change the world. What we need to do is either get rid of aviation fuel, or at least tax it properly to start with, and that would help the transition to a fuel which wasn't so carbon intensive. So we need to think about these system solutions which can shift quickly the whole economy and not go as slowly as we have been.
Thank you very much. So I have one follow-up question on that. So I would get rid of coal pretty much. It seems seems pretty obvious, right? It's the biggest carbon-emitting fuel, and it's still in wide use. And there's companies still investing in new plants for using coal, which are going to be in use for decades. I've had some chats with economists in South Africa and in Mongolia, so two countries that are quite heavily reliant on coal, and they see it as a really huge obstacle, because yes, they understand they need to move beyond coal, but at the same time, there's they have high levels of unemployment, and they don't see how they can make the transition in the short term. Any advice for that?
So if you look at developed countries, the coal industry does not employ that many people. It's down to about 40,000 in the United States. They employ over 400,000 in the solar industry. And Australia, again, the numbers actually employed in coal are going down because a modern coal mine is mechanized. Now, in some countries where you have relatively cheap labor, they will employ more. But over time, those jobs are going to go. They're going to go because of the economics of the industry, and they'll get mechanized out. So they can't hope to keep lots of jobs in coal because the economics of the industry won't allow it. So they need to let go. What the real problem here is not the jobs, it's the vested interest represented by the owners of the coal mines and the coal companies that are going to stop change. There's much more jobs to be had by investing in solar and investing in wind, particularly in hot countries like South Africa and other places. And the problem there is an upfront cost for the investment. And this is where we should be using the internationally rich economies, development finance, to help fund those initiatives, which will both create the jobs and create the renewable energy for the future, and enable us to move away from these old-fashioned technologies, which inevitably will be employing fewer and fewer people, whatever happens.
Okay, super. Well understood. Thank you, Paul. So I would then pose the same question to Lorenzo. If you could reflect on what are our biggest hurdles, and what if anything can and should be pushed through easily.
Thanks, Dawn. Let me first say that I've enjoyed very much the conference, and that is a pleasure to be on this panel. Now, I agree, of course, with what both Elizabeth and Paul have said, but let me point two issues. The first one is that I think we have targets pretty clear now, which is already, I think, big progress compared to a few years ago in terms of carbon emission reduction and net zero in 2050. We have path to achieve that in terms of emissions. And I agree that we still lack a strategy. In this case, I think I would not dismiss the carbon taxation, easily, because as actually Paul has said, we need, very comprehensive strategy, and it's super difficult to put in place a comprehensive strategy because, there are zillions of trade-off of interest of industries that don't want, to pay more than other industries. So the negotiation there, I think, are extremely complicated. While, the carbon tax, that it shouldn't be the only tools, of course. You can combine carbon taxes with a lot of other, tools and fiscal instruments, from energy efficiency to public incentives to even public spending directly, public investment in green sector. So you can think about an array of tools that actually I think is the way to go, right? Because you want to complement, what is a supply side shock, which is the carbon tax, with a demand support, which is public support. And I think if you combine those two things, you can, make a lot of progress. Now, but the carbon tax, I think, has to be part of the solution. I think we have to keep pushing, even, for a start from a low level. But, is the way in which you align all the incentives at the same time without having to negotiate with a lot of industry and sectors and association exactly who's going to do what, right? And so I think, as I said, we have to keep pushing for that as economists, and so I'll hope we can share some some agreement on that. On the low-hanging fruit, I agree. I mean, it's very difficult. I remember, all these debates on fuel subsidies in emerging economies, and it seemed to me to be a low-hanging fruit just to remove these fuel subsidies. But then this actually is not easy at all, and this goes back to what actually Elizabeth has said, that there is a lot of income distribution issues, related to the climate policies. And in many countries, these subsidies are a way of, supporting. I mean, apparently, they claim, right, it's a way of supporting, low-income families. In certain countries, if you do, proper studies, you actually see that are the more well-off that actually gain the most from these subsidies. They have larger houses, more cars, and so they actually end up benefiting the most. But the narrative is that those subsidies are supposed to help the poor, right? And so it's extremely complicated, and that I think is the big challenge, right? Is the big challenge on how somehow disentangle, the distributional issues from the climate issue, because you can't do that. I mean, these are two different problems, and you don't have, to support the poor through actions that actually hurt the climate, and so I think economies should, push for that. And in this case, again, the public sector has a role to play, not only in supporting the transition, to green investments, but also in making sure there are tools, social security programs for specific sectors that could support the distributional and can take care of the distributional issues.
Thank you, Lorenzo. So that's I think really interesting points that you all seem to have made. One of the issues that was raised yesterday, Rick van der Ploeg in our keynote presentation said, the very first thing to do is just to scrap fossil fuel subsidies, because they're just not the most effective way to redistribute. But I think you're sort of warning us that that's not the easiest, not necessarily the easiest option. Now, I think I have a hand raised. Robert, did you raise your hand, or am I not reading this correctly?
No, I think yes, you're reading it correctly. We're seeming to go in an economic direction, so maybe this comment is too late, but I would ask us to rethink what the meaning of low-hanging fruit is. And to me, the definition of low-hanging fruit is there are now technologies that are available that are simply better than the old ones that really reduce carbon emissions. So I'm thinking of things like electric cars. And there, what you have to do is you don't have to kind of like browbeat people into like wanting them or bribe them. It's just, how can policymakers really kind of get the ball rolling in the same way they think about learning by doing in technology? Can we as economists think about the market penetration of these quote better carbon-free technologies? What can we do to stimulate it? And so one of the things that I think about is, I'm not a teenage girl, but there are these internet influencers who kind of like hype all these, clothes or iPods or whatever. You could also think about influencers who are pushing, here in the United States, and I'm sure they're popular in Europe, these split systems that are kind of heat pump air conditioners that do away with really the need, or largely do away with the need for burning fossil fuels for heating purposes, and are much more efficient than air conditioners. Or they find that people who are connected on social media with other people who own an electric car, they tend to get electric cars beyond the strict economic calculations of should I buy an electric car or not. And so when I think about low-hanging fruit, it's what can we as policymakers, as economists do to speed that adoption of technologies that are better. These are not poor technologies. So I have a Chevy Bolt. I would never go back to an internal combustion engine if I don't have to. What can we do to like speed that transition to technologies? And sorry if I've taken us off course, but it seemed more appropriate after the first two speakers.
Thanks very much, Robert. So I would ask if any of our panelists want to comment on that. How can we tap into the influencers market to help push through our policies? But I also, before we do that, I will read out. I've got a question here from Bera. Is the carbon budget becoming important to assure the implementation of climate mitigation strategies? And will this allow a better alignment for governments, cities, organizations towards the reduction of carbon emissions? So I guess the question aims at having a carbon budget explicit. Does that help to focus policy, and are we moving forward in that direction? If any of the panelists want to jump in, please. Elizabeth.
So I wasn't sure if you could see my hand. Yeah, so I was just going to have a quick response to Robert. I would say we're definitely in a higher income world here. And I think that's where I sort of talk about this resistance to change. So if I put my chemistry hat on, I think sometimes what you need is a catalyst. So I went through the same thing, whereas I was really nervous about, I had range anxiety with an electric car. A lot of people do. I've talked to my friends about this. It's one of the key things why people don't. So you almost need a catalyst, and that's the government nudge or the influencer. So, the catalyst is, you've got to get over this hump to get to a better place, or maybe we want to be a better place up there. But once you have your electric car, you're like, it's a dream, you never want to go back, but it takes a long time to get there, and you need that catalyst. That might be an influencer. So when it is this idea that you're going from one state to a better state, where there's a hump, I think that really works, Robert. But in a poor country like Mongolia, there I think it's more like health benefits. In that country, people are dying from air pollution because they're burning coal, but people are getting foreign exchange because they're selling it to China, where they're dying of air pollution. So higher income country issues, and where the technology is on the individual, you need an individual catalyst. Maybe at a country level, you need a country catalyst, and that's called government, isn't it? Government policy can take us from a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium. Once we're there, we're happy there.
And Dawn, perhaps I could have a go at the carbon budget question. I think the two issues here. First of all, the question says setting carbon budget for each country. I don't think we can have national carbon budgets. It won't get us there. The majority of the world's emissions these days are coming out of China and India. Actually, a lot of China's emissions, of course, is from exports to places like the UK and the US, where carbon emissions locally are going down, but partly we're importing them from China. But the real problem is this: our carbon budget, really, in my view, is zero or negative. We have got 80% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we should have on average for the last 800,000 years. If we move to net zero tomorrow, we stick with 80% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I've got no confidence that's stable. The global warming is going to carry on for quite a long time, even if we achieved net zero tomorrow. So for me, the carbon budget is negative. We need to get back to the level of carbon in the atmosphere that we used to have on average for the last 800,000 years. And starting to talk about carbon budgets where it's okay to emit a certain amount. No, it isn't. It isn't okay to emit any carbon. We've got to crush down on everywhere we possibly can as fast as we can if we want to stop and reverse global warming. We're already at plus 1.2. And this is going to carry on for a long time, regardless of what we do. And we're already seeing the disasters start to happen. It's just going to get worse and worse. So I don't think government budgets works, but carbon plans of how we are going to decarbonize, that we do need. And we need it in quite some detail. And I'm afraid that's going to have to be some sort of central planning. I don't think, but you could disaggregate some of it out to industry. You could say, you owe industry, you go and work out the plans for your sector and your sector and your sector. But we do need those plans for how we can reduce carbon emissions as quickly as possible across the board.
Paul, Lorenzo, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So first of all, of course, there's a wide range of policies, of course, electric cars and, energy efficiency in buildings. These are all things that have to, move forward, and it could be influencer, but I prefer to think about government incentives, and, that usually can be planned more, broadly and efficiently. What I wanted to say is that we don't discuss very much. I don't think the policy makers discuss very much about adaptation spending, because if we think that there is such a persistent in the climate trajectories going forward, that even if we try to slow down emission, there's going to be warming to a certain extent, and this is going to bring about some natural or climate related natural event. I think we should think more about how we should plan our building, our production plants, our infrastructures a little bit more. That's not my field, so that's more a question than a statement. And but sometimes I'm surprised to see that there are areas in the world that get hit year over year, and even in a growing fashion by hurricanes and stuff like that. It seems that this goes away. There is no memory. People think it's just one-off, and they don't foresee that maybe there is a trend there, and maybe if there is a one-off and you try to forget, it's bad luck. You don't think you need to plan ahead. For this hurricane coming back in 1, 2, 3, 4 years. But if you actually think that there is a trend there, then I think you want to plan, going forward. I know that for continental Europe, this might be less of an issue, but I'm not so sure. I'm not a climatologist, so I'm not well equipped to answer those questions. But I think that my sense is that, let's put it this way, that the community policymakers are not discussing enough about how to adapt to a certain extent. It's not that we have to, of course we want to mitigate, right? But in the meantime, maybe it could be worth also thinking about some adaptation policies.
Thank you, Lorenzo. So you mentioned forward planning, and that kind of brings me into the next question I wanted to put to you, which is just going back for one more comment on carbon taxes, which you each mentioned. Paul, you said there's only a little bit that you can gain from a carbon taxes. It'd have to be so high in order to be effective. But one of the sort of takeaways from the session that we had yesterday on climate policy and the financial system seemed to be that it would be really helpful to have a policy where each country were to clearly lay out a forward path for the carbon price, over the next 20 years. Because the way that so policy commitments have been done so far is they said, well, we're going to reduce emissions by 65% or whichever the country target is by such and such a date, but haven't really said exactly how they're going to get there. There was a suggestion that, a clear path would allow all of the investors and financial markets to adjust to that sort of known reality, to eliminate a lot of the uncertainty, and so could sort of reduce the costs of transition, if you like, if it was politically feasible to do so. Does anyone want to have any comments on that, or any other comments on carbon pricing in general?
So I'll just jump right in. I don't know. So, you know, that's a very interesting idea. The problem is that you're laying a carbon tax or any other instrument on top of energy prices. And energy prices are incredibly volatile and noisy on their own. And so when you drop in a very predictable carbon tax over 20 years and people know it, they still don't know what energy prices are going to be. And that creates big difficulties. So right now I'm working on this little paper on people buying automobiles versus light trucks. So I'm in the United States and I'm a lot more macho than I look, and light trucks, you know, pickup trucks are the thing. And it turns out that the signal to noise ratio and the price of motor gasoline influences whether people buy light trucks or automobiles. And getting people to buy cars is difficult because the noise obfuscates any kind of worries about efficiency with regard to buying a light truck. And now it turns out that cars are an inferior good relative to light trucks, and it's got to be hard to get people to move on that, even if you tell them very clearly about the carbon tax. The underlying volatility in energy prices is something you have to deal with, let alone, sorry to go on so long, let alone the idea of energy producers trying to sabotage the effect of energy prices, of carbon taxes, because you're cutting into their market, so to speak. So enough.
Thank you, Robert. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to briefly say, I suppose, you know, if you look at what the UK and many European countries is, we're just putting a regulation, you know, for partly that reason, which is just, you know, we are going to phase out combustion engine vehicles, and this is the time frame. So I think in terms of planning ahead, yes, it's really important. You always have to worry, what economists always worry about is if you announce a policy ahead of time, people, you know, do what they can before that, you know, to rent seek or to get what they can get. So you can actually have the reverse policy. We've banned the use of peat in gardens in the UK in about 2 or 3 years time. And some of us are going, well, we understand some people have their livelihood digging peat, but why not just ban it today? And there was a bit of concern that, you know, some people are just not going to care about peat bogs and say, well, let me get as much peat in my garden as I can this year and next year. So of course you can't function when people just keep surprising policies on you. And when it comes to climate change, we do need to plan, but somehow we've got to also be really careful that people don't behave in, you know, what I think I was taught this 30 years ago, you know, at grad school, that people don't look at that policy in the future and things end up worse. So I like Robert's point, because it's about where the uncertainties are, where the noise is, and sometimes a regulation just gives you a lot more certainty, and sometimes a future ban. I normally hate bans. I tell people I hate bans, but actually when it comes to climate change, bans are quite a good regulation if they're phased in and you get people a chance to move out.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Lorenzo, did you have a
yes, thanks. No, I just wanted to, say that I think there is a lot of uncertainty created by policies these days, right? Because you have this target for net zero, but no clue exactly how we're going to get there. And if you look at the financial system, regulators are struggling, try to, manage and to see how risky is the portfolio of financial institutions. And it's very difficult because it's not really clear how we are going to get to net zero. So it's not really clear, which industry are going to be hit the most from the transition. I mean, you can guess, of course, but there might be, uncertainties there. And of course, and one of, you don't know very well, these scenarios analysis that financial institutions are starting to incorporate to do climate risk analysis. You have this late transition risk, right? That you do nothing for the next 10 years, then suddenly you have to do a lot of mitigation policies, and this is a risk. So I think that it's not that a question of announcing, but having a path or giving a direction of how we're going to go to net zero is essential. And as I said, carbon pricing has to be part of it. By the way, I'm not just talking about carbon taxes here. Of course, there are emission trading systems. These systems actually are going, are increasing around the world. If I'm not mistaken, China is setting up one, or has set up one recently. And so I think you can really, it's probably too ambitious to give a complete path of, the carbon price going forward. And of course, there is uncertainty in energy prices. We know that. But at least, you have a direction. I guess everybody can see that there is a policy direction, that you're going to adjust that depending on how things are going to develop. But at least you know what is the direction. I think everybody can start adjusting to that, even the financial sector, which is going to be extremely important.
Well, did you want to?
Yeah. Just very quickly, of course, people want certainty. Business always says they want certainty, but we can't forecast the economy 2 years ahead, let alone give certainty over 30 years. Just look at what a macro forecast from 2 years ago would have looked like, given what's happened. But there's some things we can be certain about. We can be certain that global temperatures are going to continue to rise and be very volatile, and it's the volatility which generates the weather events which cause the risk. We can be certain that governments are going to have to take action to reduce carbon emissions. We're going to be certain the economy is going to have to change towards being much lower carbon emitting. We are going to have to price carbon emissions out. This isn't a matter of increasing the price of diesel and petrol so people drive a bit less. We need to get rid of petrol and diesel driven cars. And ultimately that will be bans, because cities have already announced that they're not going to allow fossil fuel driven cars from certain dates. So the problem with carbon tax is we do need them. They should be consistent, but they're all about marginal changes. And we're not looking for marginal changes here. We're looking for big changes, which require a move away from, not a reduction in fossil fuel usage. Now, these things I think are pretty certain, even though we can't be certain about exactly what level of a carbon tax is or what's going to happen in the economy. There are some certainties out there, much more certainties than there are in most transitions in the economy. Now, if you go back to the internet revolution, nobody had any real idea of what how that was going to go. When you go back to electricity or the introduction of motor car, nobody could easily have foreseen what's going to happen. Here we've got a lot more certainty about the general direction in which we have to go. What we really need is that general direction from government about the strategy and the way we're going to approach this. And we're just lacking a little bit in that strategy department at the moment. This list of initiatives, there's 400 odd initiatives out there for reducing carbon, but we just need a bit more of a comprehensive strategy. That's all people will remember. They won't remember the whole list of things that are being done.
Don, sorry, can I just add one thing here?
Yeah.
What Paul has said is, it's convincing, but sometimes I think, there's an issue of timing. We have very little time before exhausting the carbon budget or whatever, however we want to call it. And this issue of time, I think, is essential, and probably it's a difference with respect to past energy transitions or even, past revolution like the internet. We didn't have to rush, when, we had those past innovations, while we have somehow a limited time. And the uncertainty is either we do a lot in the next few years and we get, whatever to 2 degrees, 3 degrees increase by the end of the century, whatever, or we don't do enough, and so we get a lot, more higher temperature and climate shocks. And this is a big uncertainty. I mean, Paul, you can say the direction is clear, but the time is very short, and we don't know whether that's enough to get to 2% or 4%, right? So this is a huge uncertainty, and it's a huge uncertainty because we don't know whether we're going to mitigate a lot or we will need to adapt a lot. These are two different things, right? And so I think that the uncertainty actually is very high, even if you know the direction.
Thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to move on. I think that's a good point to move on because you've highlighted that there's a lot of uncertainties and a lot of unknowns. So this might be a good time to introduce the second issue that I would like to raise, which I think is something that will be of relevance to everybody who's online now. Just looking forward, what do you think? What would you point us to as researchers? So where do you see the crucial research gaps in terms of delivering this an effective policy? We need a clear strategy. Is there information gaps that governments simply don't have, which is stopping them from making a good policy going forward? And where should researchers, especially economists, which most of us online are, although not everyone, where should we focus our attention so that we can usefully contribute to this debate and the design of efficient policy? For example, are there big data gaps that need to be met? Or issues that we just haven't been focusing on where we should. And I welcome anyone to post in the chat their ideas and suggestions as well, or issues that you've had difficulty in doing your own research because of a lack of adequate data. So thank you. Paul, would you like to start out this one?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of data which is missing, and I see this from the financial regulatory side, where the chief risk officers of UK banks are now the senior manager responsible for climate change risks in their organizations, and they're sitting around saying, how are we going to do this without any data? And there's huge amounts of data. So for example, the banks may have huge mortgage books and they don't know which of those houses have been insured against flood risk. Okay, even if they insist on the mortgagee having insurance on day one, they don't keep a track thereafter of what sort of insurance they've got. So they don't know what the energy rating on those houses is, the energy certificate. So there's a whole lot of data which you would need to manage financial risk. I think the big problem here is certainly risk management is just typically backward looking at past data sets, looking at the risk of defaults and so on. And the problem we've got is that none of the historical data is going to tell us that much about what happens in the future, because temperature is rising on some sort of a trend. The trend isn't linear, it's not fixed. The series for temperature is clearly non-stationary in mean and probably in variance as well. So we're trying to work out what the risks are going to be in a future, which you have to extrapolate these trends uncertainty from the past. So I agree with Lenzo, the uncertainty about the temperature is huge, and what effect that will have. The forecasts you tend to see in the climate change literature are very smooth. At best, they'll have some confidence intervals around them. And what you don't see is the volatility that's going to be on all of these paths. And it's the volatility which generates the events and the risks. And so what we need to do is actually be much more forward-looking in the analysis. And we need a lot more use of modern techniques. We need to use stochastic simulation of nonlinear systems to try and work out what some of the parameters of these distributions are going to look like going forward, because they're not going to look like what we've had in the past. And so, yes, there are lots of data gaps, but the data from the past is only going to be of limited use to us, I think. And so we're moving in the financial world, we're moving into scenario analysis, which is much more sort of well, what if this happens? What if that happens? Let's paint a scenario and see if we can work out some issues. And from that, you probably can't use detailed data so much in that sort of scenario analysis. It's more about what are the big parameters going to look like.
Thank you. That's well, it's helpful. I'm not sure exactly where to start when we can't use our past data to understand what's going to happen in the future. But I would ask Lorenzo to give us some more ideas on things we can. Oh, sorry, if we just before you do in there, we've got a hand raised. Robert, you want to come in quickly on that?
Yeah, I would argue just the opposite, that there is a lot of data that we need. And so especially guiding that transition. So as people said, we know where we need to get, but we're not really sure where we are now. So about a decade ago, I started a company called First Fuel, and we've been bought out now. But the idea was we did energy efficiency remotely by looking at each building's energy use on an hourly basis. And literally, when I got my hands on that data, I was just amazed at what we could figure out about a building. And I could imagine, we would like the same kind of information for commercial buildings, for residential buildings. I would love to have, as a person interested in energy, I would love to have all the information available about the sales of these new convection stoves. Or, when we think about kind of heating systems, oil systems, natural gas systems, how do we get rid of them? The problem is we don't have any ideas about the houses that have those systems. All that data, all the data we could use to guide the transition is held proprietary data held by gas companies, oil companies, electric companies, and they're in the midst of trying to monetize it. And it would help tremendously in guiding the transition if we had access as researchers to that data, trying to figure out how we can nudge, how we can move forward the transition based upon very detailed understanding of what households look like. So that's my wish list.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, very good. So that gives us some things to look at. Lorenzo, please.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Of course, there are tons of data gaps, and I agree with both Paul and Robert. I mean, with Robert in the sense that there are definitely a lot of data that we could gather that are already there and that could be useful. But of course, also with Paul, there are a lot of more data, like emissions from companies that most of them we don't know, and that we would need to know would be important. So there is a huge amount of data gathering that is still we still have to do. But I think in terms of, I was thinking while you were asking the questions, and my sense, my gut feeling, let's put it this way, is that we don't need much more data to know what we have to do, right? Where I think is the problem is on the political side, let's put it this way, right? So is an understanding how the voters and households, what do they think about that? And I don't know, and I'm surprised that I should know, by the way. Maybe some of the panelists know better or can point to some research, but the idea is what actually are voters thinking about climate change. And in different countries, you see this poll saying that I don't know, 40-50% of voters just don't know enough about, they don't have clear opinions and stuff like that. And I think this is one area where actually I would I would probably try to get a better understanding. And because, you know, we don't, let's put it this way, I don't think we have a common narrative. We don't have a common narrative for that. You know, certain people think they can contribute, you know, by changing their cars. And, you know, that's enough, or by walking to the office instead of, but that's not enough, right? And so that's not so they don't have the right narrative, probably. Certain other people think that there's nothing they can do because, you know, it's a problem of big companies and you know, agriculture and public policies, and maybe that's the wrong narrative as well. So I guess I know that might not be very helpful as a comment, but I think we should probably understand better how people think about the issue and trying to build a common narrative that is helpful in moving forward. But I don't know exactly what this implies. So maybe you can help me, or
It sounds like we should be moving into political economy studies.
yeah.
Elizabeth, would you like to give us your 2 cents on that? Maybe tell us a bit about your forthcoming research agenda.
So I'm a very uneconomist economist, but so I'll suggest I've circled 3 things that I've been noting down. One is I don't think we understand systemic risk enough. I think the people who do understand it are the reinsurance people, but they won't want to give us their data. I think so. I tend to avoid talking about adaptation purely because plenty of people talk about it, but there's going to be some of us who stay pure to sort of mitigation. But having said that, I work in low and middle income countries a lot, so I do care about development and growth pathways that are consistent with adaptation and mitigation. But I do think, I'm not sure where that came from. Anyway, I do think understanding systemic risk is really important. And it sort of links to what Paul said about those non-linearities, that the future is very different from the past. And in the future, we're going to get these fat tails. We're going to have to really worry about those low probability, but increasing probability, high risk events. And of course, the mitigation allows us to kind of try to reduce how often they are and how severe they are. And those are the triggers, if you like, for the systemic crisis. But I don't think we really understand how we can try to reduce that systemic crisis. I suspect, but I shouldn't say this out loud, but I'm guessing that if you think about it, if insurance companies price in systemic risk, they're going to be less competitive than those who don't. So I think it's really important that we really all lay out there what the systemic risk is and why it's going to be really costly. You know, these are big, big costs that ripple across multiple societies. The other thing I wrote down was we maybe need to think more about the costs of not mitigating. So often we talk about mitigation, and although probably everyone listening here knows that the benefits are going to be greater than the costs, sometimes we forget that by doing nothing, people are harmed. So your classic one is your air pollution, right? So we think a lot about, you know, the coal and, you know, the stranded assets of coal in the ground and the coal miners' jobs, even though, as I completely agree with, I think as Paul said, they're disappearing fast. But the costs of not action on the health of people is huge. And if we think about the costs of not mitigating on the health of young children, whether it's, you know, on the South Circular and Ella Kissy-Debraj, who lost her life to air pollution, or whether it's all those people in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia who are suffering chronic health problems from the air pollution there. Or I lived in China for 6 months and I felt mortified by the end of it that I was inflicting this pollution on my children. You know, I actually felt a deep guilt. Okay, that was 2. And the other one I circled was maybe as economists, how we operationalize concepts of climate justice. So I think we hear people talk about climate justice a lot, or you do if, like me, you work in low and middle income countries a lot. And we hear about it, and the political scientists talk about it, the development studies talk about it, but I'm not sure that if economists have really thought about how do we operationalize that, because climate justice is not just a sort of nice idea. Climate justice, yes, it's about morality and what's right, but it's also about the pragmatics of how we actually take those steps. So 4th point, very quickly, exactly what Lorenzo and Paul are saying. We know where we want, we more or less know where we are. We know where we want to be. We've got all those technologies, all those policies, but you know, when are we going to take the steps today, next week, next 6 months, this year, so that we actually start seeing total emissions going down globally? Yeah, so 4 random points.
Okay, thank you very much. So it looks like we, so political economy is obviously high on our agenda. Health economics, I think bringing in some of those ideas that Elizabeth was mentioning, and also working with insurance companies. So trying to team up with the insurance and the reinsurance industries to get access to their data and develop some research programs along those lines. Those are a few of my my sort of takeaways that I've grabbed from your.
Can I, Dawn, can I add
Please.
one point? I like very much the talk by Partha Dasgupta yesterday on natural capital. And, you know, I don't know much about natural, I mean, about those issues. I'm really a macroeconomist, so I know my limits. But I think, you know, I guess people do care a lot about natural capital in general. And there, my sense, as I said, it's not my field. My sense is that there is a lack of data and research, and, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but there is no, you know, enough information exactly how much we are depleting, you know, some of those resources. I've told myself I'm going to read the Dasgupta report, but then it's 500 pages. I'm not sure when I'll be able to go through it. Can someone tell me why it was so long? I mean, can't you just write something that's 200 pages? Just kidding. And but I think that is probably an area where more data should be collected and maybe some more research.
So that, I think, yes, I think just going back to the discussion yesterday about natural capital. So we've been talking for years about the inadequacy of GDP, right, as a measure of well-being. But how do we force ourselves? How do we force economists and macroeconomic modelers to move beyond that? You know, that we're still modeling, you know, what's going to happen to GDP. How do we make, is it because we don't understand the data? Is it because we just aren't interested? I mean, I think neither of those are true. So what's stopping us? Any thoughts on that from moving towards broader measures of well-being?
If I can just jump in, sorry, then I'll stay quiet. I guess, you know, GDP is a measure of market transactions. So basically, you know, it's final goods and services sold in some markets. So you need, you know, prices and quantities to compute GDP. And what is missing, I think, for example, in the case of natural capital, are market prices. But I guess this is one of the points of Dasgupta, you could use, you know, shadow prices if you were able to estimate those shadow prices. So the question is, go out, try to estimate those shadow prices, and you know, and then you have a measure, you know, you have quantities, you have shadow prices, and you can add to the GDP, you know, what is the depletion or accumulation of the different natural capital with their shadow prices. That's just a wild guess, but I think that's the way I would move forward.
Yeah. Dawn, perhaps I could add to that. I think, first of all, can I just mention that Cambridge, we do have a group of insurers called ClimateWise who get together and do have data and do some good work in this area. So it's not that the insurers won't share their data. There are reinsurers on there too. But GDP is only at best a proxy for welfare. So if you're looking at, say, I don't know, the next quarter or a couple of years ahead, GDP is approximate for welfare, but it's not a good long-term measure for welfare. We've always known that. It basically, you have to remember, it's not just, you can think of it as total output, you can also think of it as total income or total expenditure, and it's a measure of how much of the economy is monetized. And so increasingly, I think it's diverging from reality because we've got so much more activity going on now, which is not monetized. People use the internet, they write lots of stuff, they put it up for free. Other people download it and read it at the margin for free. You've got a whole load of economic activity going on, which isn't counted in GDP. And as we improve welfare, we're going to need to get to a point where the economy is growing in terms of living standards, but we haven't got more stuff being produced, because there's going to be a limit to the amount of stuff we can produce and own, and the stuff that we do produce is going to have to be largely recycled. And we need some, but if we're improving the quality of the atmosphere, that is an improvement in living standards, which somehow we need to capture and wouldn't be captured by current measures of GDP. So I don't know whether or not GDP can be adapted, or whether we should just move to something completely different in terms of radically changing. But GDP is fine as a measure of, say, total income or total expenditure. We should leave it at that and not pretend it's a measure of welfare. So my vote would be try to moving something a bit different in terms of measuring living standards, which wasn't based just around income, expenditure and output, because otherwise it gets very, very tricky.
I think can I jump in? I think, yeah, Paul, I think I agree with you. It's funny because I come from I hate the word development, but I come from a development background. So I was trained as what one might be called a development economist, and I've taught it. And you know, one of the first things we talk about is, well, GDP is, you know, not very interesting, and it's got nothing to do with, you know, welfare, development, happiness. What we care about is just, like we all say, a simple proxy. And I think we've talked about this for a long time. So, you know, if you study low-income countries, you talk about the Human Development Index. We just talk about other indicators such as life expectancy, or, you know, there's so many we explore, you know, we talk about, we think what's better, and we go, well, GDP is quite a good proxy. And so it's a pretty good proxy if you look just at the well-being of people, but it's a disaster even as a proxy when you start looking at the assets you're running down that you don't take into account in that green accounting, and when you don't think about the fact that there's these sort of global public goods that individual countries destroy at will. So so at first, you know, one might think, well, we do look at that anyway, but it's even well-being is problematic because it's not taking account of that loss of natural capital and the destruction of public goods. And I think, you know, I think whether it's stuff we're writing on the internet for free and making available for free, increasingly our economies have changed so much, right? Because so much is about global public goods that didn't seem to matter before, but we're hitting planetary boundaries. A lot of the activities we undertake are structured very differently from your sort of neoclassical economics. And so it's really tricky, because when we get into that situation where we realize we don't need stuff and we can recycle it, and Robert, you know, the teenage girls are also now, they don't buy clothes from shops anymore. They just send them around to each other, right? I've got 2 teenage daughters, and they don't buy in shops. They buy off each other and then sell to someone else afterwards. And Royal Mail makes a lot of money. I can't remember what the website is, but, you know, there's these sort of micro little communities of people who are sharing, and so they can have a different outfit every week, but no outfits will be made for a long time because, you know, these don't wear out that quickly. So, you know, that we then start to talk about, you know, radical shifts and changes in our economies, don't we, where we say we don't need to buy stuff, we can share and we can recycle. And then we get into that problem that you are going to get these natural monopolies. Oh, thank you, someone popped up the word Depop. Yes, Depop, that's what my kids use all the time. And we're going to then have this whole shift in the way societies work. You know, we can already see the Amazons of this world. You've got a situation where it's a natural monopoly that one person gets very rich, and there's a lot of people on a gig economy, and then we'll stop buying so much stuff, so the people on the gig economy won't be cycling around our houses and things. So there's actually, if we go down that pathway that Paul, I don't know how long I've been calling you David, the Paul's going down that talking about, it's a radical, worrying transformation. And so the easy thing to do is to keep buying stuff, right? Because we keep the economy going, and governments keep telling us to buy stuff. You know, with COVID, the problem was we weren't buying enough stuff. The shops had to be open so we could buy stuff. Because we're stuck, aren't we, in this situation where that's how our economies work. And so whether or not we price things right, and whether or not we go away from GDP, and whether or not we think about natural capital and what it's worth, fundamentally, this radical transformation of our economies is terrifying in what it means, really terrifying, but it's going to happen. And if we can manage it rather than be forced into it, I think that would be nice.
You want to make it back?
Can I add one thing? Now, this is actually a very interesting discussion because, yeah, true, GDP is just a measure of production and income, right? Why policymakers are so concerned about GDP? Because it's income, it's jobs. And so should we, you know, keep GDP as it is and construct some, you know, ancillary measures, let's put it this way, complementary measures? Or should we try to, you know, change the way we measure GDP, because that is actually the target of policymakers? And, you know, that I don't know, probably both. But the thing is that at the end of the day, I guess GDP is still the target of policymakers, and that is an issue. And I guess we should compile, you know, GDP measures, additional GDP measures that have some shadow prices for the, you know, what actually we are, you know, we are depleting in terms of natural capital, and give and other, you know, related issues, and give a price to that, because that is actually a better measure of net income, let's say, let's put it this way. And if policymaker would target that, I think that would be better. Now, some policymakers are shifting a little bit, and they are considering, you know, wider range of indicators. That is true, but my sense is that still, you know, the growth figure, it's the important one, and there might be a mistake on the part of policymakers. I don't know. I would be happy to hear what you think about that.
It's interesting, Lorenzo, if I may, Dawn, it's interesting because if you ask most people, I don't think most people have got any idea how GDP is defined, the fact that it's a value-added measure. They don't know what the latest numbers are. They don't
But they know their job.
They can. They have a sense of what's happening around them.
Yeah.
So they might know the unemployment sort of figures because they can tell whether friends of theirs have got jobs or not. They probably know inflation because they can see prices going up and down. But GDP is a concept. So I don't think people, ordinary voters, care much about GDP numbers. They do care about whether the economy is doing well or not. And so I think there is plenty of room there to explore other metrics. The problem is, can you come up with metrics which are independent of the political party presenting them, so that people have credibility in them, and which match people's feelings and expectations of what they can see in the economy around them? And I come into this because there's been a long debate about whether we should target inflation or target nominal GDP as a nominal indicator. I said, well, people know what inflation is. They can see it happening. They've got a feel for it. They've got no idea what nominal GDP is at all. And so it's obvious which one you should choose as a target if you want to tie down expectations. And I think somehow we need something which people have more of affinity with in terms of growth and well-being. And the GDP numbers don't really cut it. They're so heavily revised apart from anything else. 2 years later, you can have completely different GDP numbers. So they're totally misleading in that sense.
No, Paul, I do agree, but GDP and employment, they're pretty similar, right? So maybe people look at employment and policymaker targets employment, but it's the same thing, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you are targeting production, right?
Employment, yeah, but you can have high employment without much output. It's depends on productivity and income. I think it's something more complicated, and unemployment more rather than employment as well. It's the number of people who want jobs and can't get them, and then how much they get paid also comes into it, because you can have full employment with people not earning very much. This is what we've had for the last 8 years or so in the UK, and that isn't a very happy outcome for people either. And so there's something more going on here, and I don't know what the answer is. I should say I don't think the answer is GDP. And I think people will increasingly ignore it anyway. So.
So we haven't come up with the answer, but we have raised a lot of questions, which is exactly what I was hoping you might do, because I think I've got an idea for a research project now, in sort of delving more deeply into some of these issues. So thanks very much. A little bit of personal return from that. One of the comments that Professor Dasgupta made yesterday was in terms of, yes, okay, Lorenzo, you said we don't really know how to price the parts of natural capital. What he said was, you know what, we've been underpricing it for so long in terms of pricing it at zero. It doesn't really matter. You can probably put it up, twice as high as you think it might be supposed to be, and you're still not overestimating it. So, so maybe we have a bit of flexibility, there. I did have one more question that I wanted to put to you before we draw things to a close, which is slightly different sort of question, but closely related to the previous discussion. So I if you could just speculate, sort of in the short term. So we think climate issues we have a sort of long-term perspective on that, but over the next, 5 years or longer, if you think that's too short, over the short term, where do you see the biggest risks to the global economy from climate-related issues or shocks? And I know there's a long list of things that they might come from. So, just for example, is it going to be a major weather-related shock, or from financial stresses due to climate-related policy changes, a sudden realization of stranded assets, a spike or a collapse in fuel prices? I don't know. We've speculated about a potential trade war due to a lack of coordination on setting climate policy objectives. What are the things that you think we should be wary of in the near term? Sorry, Lorenzo, could I start you off on that one?
Really? Okay. As a general principle, I think risk comes more from factors that we do not control than from factors that we do control to a certain extent. So I'm not that much, for example, concerned about the financial sector. I think they will work their way out of it. I mean, they move stuff quickly, and there might be some tension, but that's not my main concern. I think my main concern is weather events, because if we don't take serious action, I'm not a climatologist, but the projection is for temperature increasing, and this will bring about, with some uncertainty, but extreme weather events. And so this is a concern. And another concern that I have is international tensions. I'm not sure whether trade wars or stuff like that, but if those climate events starts to be problematic, and you have a distribution of these climate events, they typically will focus on, I guess, the hottest area at the global level. And so this is going to create, tensions between, I guess, some poor countries and other countries, because those poor countries are not the ones that are supposed to mitigate, and are the advanced or large emerging countries that are supposed to mitigate. And this is going to create potentially enormous tensions. And on top of that, this idea of the carbon border tax, which is proposed in Europe, is already creating tensions with, for example, the US. And of course, if there is no alignment at the international level on what to do on mitigation, there is the potential also for trade tensions. I'm not sure whether trade wars, but definitely trade tensions. So these are my worries. Let's put it this way.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Elizabeth, you want to go next?
Sure. Okay, I'm going to say systemic crises again. Okay, so if we think about 2005, Hurricane Katrina caused $200 billion of damage. But one of the critically worrying things is it landed very close to the south of Mississippi. So what does that do? It disrupts global grain routes. 2011, I know it was El Nino, but these kind of things we're going to have in Thailand. We got a complete disruption of their automobiles there. 2008 food crisis, we had drought in Australia, and we had the premier of Haiti toppled because rice prices spiked, even though the drought was in wheat. And I think we're in this sort of situation at the moment where efficiency kind of means just in time, and no stocks, and you'd rely on the markets, because when you've got calm water, markets function, and it's great, so just in time is efficient, and not having grain stocks is efficient, because if you need grain, you buy it from somewhere else. But increasingly, as we're having more weather shocks, increasingly we're going to have these systemic crises, and when that systemic crisis hits, then human nature jumps in, right? So your sort of classic game theory is what sort of hit us in 2008, which is it's individually rational when there's a shortage of food to go to the supermarket and buy some more. We all did that at the beginning of COVID in the UK during lockdown. So there was plenty of food, but it was all in our cupboards and nothing in the shops. And we've done that before with petrol. There was plenty of petrol in England a few years ago, but it was all in our cars because everyone filled their car. There was none in the petrol stations. So I think these systemic crises, and then when you then get a sort of breakdown of cooperation across countries. So in 2008, Thailand has never, ever, ever needed to import rice. But Thailand was like ready to put a ban on rice exports because it was just behaving like every other country. It was, you sort of seize up and you do what's individually rational for your country. That's partly why rice prices spiked, because when Thailand puts a ban on exporting rice when it's never imported rice, people start to panic. So I think in the short term, it's going to be these kind of crises. And, we're going to have to build in some kind of resilience to systems because water is choppy ahead. It's not the calm waters. And I also think, in the old days, right, when markets are functioning and prices are high somewhere because there's a shortage, the natural thing is you move stuff from where the price is low to where the price is high. It's an arbitrage condition. But now when a price is high somewhere, people's inclination, and whether it's an individual or whether it's a computer algorithm, the inclination is to hold back in the hope the prices go up even more so you can make even more selling. And we've seen computer algorithms messing things around. And we're now seeing human algorithms, and that's natural human behavior, you can't critique it, messing things around. So now when we have a sort of crisis in one place, we're almost less likely to see food moving around to the right places and more likely people hoarding, waiting for prices to go up. And I think we've got to be really worried about natural human behavior, natural rational country behavior that can lead to crises. And so, and it's a fine balance, isn't it, between loss of confidence and loss of cooperation and gain in confidence and gain in cooperation. It's how we build those structures at a global level. Really hard.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Behavior changes in a crisis. That's what we see in financial markets all the time. I'd like to phrase, I agree with both of those comments, so I'd phrase it a bit differently. My biggest worry is that people see climate change and loss of biodiversity as a long-term risk. And it is a long-term risk in the sense that the risk goes up over time. But what gets you is not the trend, it's the volatility, it's the fat tails. And those risks are with us now. So climate risk is a long-term risk, it's also a short-term risk. London could have flooded in 13, 14, nearly did, got away with it that time. It could flood this year. If we don't rebuild the Thames barrier, that's not scheduled until 2070. That's going to be too far off to prevent London from flooding. New Orleans, New York have already seen major floods. It's the physical risks seem to happen quicker than the policy risks materialize, but the policy risks can also materialize quickly. And it's how quick the risk crystallizes that affects the damage that's done and the behavioral reaction to it. So my biggest concern is that people won't realize we're moving into this world where we are going to get more and more fact-tail events. You can see it very clearly in the insurance data in terms of the number of climate-related events that have caused insurance losses. Some of it's due to more underwriting, but some of it is actually due to more events happening. And it's that volatility which I think is going to get people. And that matters for the financial sector because of financial risk. It's the unexpected shocks which are going to get us. And people thinking that this is a long-term risk then scares me, because it's not. It's here now. We've already seen it happen. We've already seen companies go bust because of climate-related events. Peabody Energy, Pacific Gas and Electric being just two of the big American ones. So we have this here and now, and it's that sense of urgency which is sometimes lacking, which worries me.
Thank you very much. Robert, did you have a comment? It looked like you wanted to.
Sure. Yeah, I think everybody has it right, and I would just add the following kind of semi-insight, and that is the world is a highly unequal place, and there are places that are critical to world infrastructure. So Elizabeth had mentioned New Orleans, but when I study the world oil market, we think about like critical pinch points in the planet or in that market. And now what we've got are weather events happening, huge heat dome right now over the western part of the United States. Eventually, one of those is gonna coincide with an important pinch point in the world economy. And when that happens, all bets are off. So we almost saw it in Texas this winter, where the whole state's entire grid was very close to going down. What happens if we get another year of this drought in the American West and there's not enough water to grow food and support people in that part of the world, and people have to start moving around? It's kind of like throwing darts at a dartboard. Eventually the dart thrown by weather is going to land at a point that's critical to the operation of the world's economy. And when that bullseye hits, that's the biggest short-term risk, at least to my perspective.
Okay, on that very sobering thoughts, we are, I'm afraid going to have to draw to a close. So I will never again say that climate is a long-term risk. It is definitely a short-term risk. I've learned that. And paradoxically, although climate change is an issue that requires global cooperation, may in fact be something that causes a breakdown in cooperation between countries. So those are my big takeaways from your comments. Thank you so much. Does anyone want to make a final comment before I draw us to a close?
I just want to thank Dawn and everybody at NYSER for all their incredible work putting this meeting together and keeping the ship running on time. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I joined Robert in thanking the organization, and also this panel was very interesting. So
Yeah, ditto, just thank you. Yeah, it's been really interesting.
Hope everybody has a good weekend.
Thank you. And I need to extend a few thanks. So first of all, to our amazing panelists, thank you so much. It's been hugely entertaining to speak with you today. I've learned a lot. Thanks, Robert, also for all of your interventions, which have, as always, been very interesting. So this session brings us to a close of this year's EUROFRAME conference, and I want to thank everyone who has participated. Huge thanks to Chloe and to Rachel for making technical arrangements to make this meeting possible on Zoom. I can't wait until next year, where hopefully we'll be meeting in person, either in Helsinki or Kiel or Warsaw. We shall see. Huge thanks to Catherine Mathieu, who has been a stalwart member of the EUROFRAME network for as long as I have and longer, and without whom this conference would never have been organized. And And thanks to everyone on the EUROFRAME Scientific Committee for all their efforts in putting this together. So I wish you all a lovely and sunny wherever you are weekend, and hope to see you in person at the next one. Bye-bye.